Welcome back, guys, to the JPS Education Portal Roundtable, and you are here with myself, Mackenzie, as always, and the very lovely, the very British, Steve Hall. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited. I know we're talking about massing, which is a subject close to my heart. I don't know anything more that we're talking about or how it's going to go, so I'm here for it. I don't know. I actually don't even know Mackenzie's views on it. I don't know if this was like you set me up against him, like he has terribly different views to me. I don't expect he does.
I love how uncertain being around me or being on a podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that I've
You've set me up.
No. We are here to talk about massing. This is Steve's wheelhouse. This is one of the topics that I feel Steve is very well equipped to discuss and share insights on. So we'll start with, what is the objective when we're massing, Steve? Obviously, muscle gain is the focus, but from a more physiological perspective, what are we actually trying to achieve?
Cool. So yeah, I guess it's hard in the fitness industry because terms are thrown around. Like when I first started getting into bodybuilding, it was like bulking was the term, and then like massing seems to have taken over there. And I don't know if that confuses people or if they think massing and bulking are different, but I guess the real thing that we're worried about there is nutritionally we're in a calorie surplus. That's what we're trying to achieve. We're eating above our maintenance. And then a mass phase is you're looking to gain weight. And then the question kind of begets kind of how fast are we gaining and all those other variables. But for the most part, the biggest difference versus if you're in a mass phase versus any other phase is you are gaining weight, you're in a calorie surplus. And that's putting you in an environment that is by itself more anabolic. That is one of the biggest things you can do to help yourself in assisting gaining muscle. And so if you're not doing that, it's going to make it harder and it's not going to make it impossible. And I guess that's something to outline, at least from my perspective from the get-go, is I think in the back in the day, I again used to think like you had to be in a surplus to gain muscle, like it was eat big to get big. And then maybe the pendulum swung the other way where people are like, oh no, don't kind of do an all-you-can-eat diet, don't get too fat. And actually you don't even, lean gains. You don't have to be in a surplus. You can kind of gain muscle and lose fat, or I guess even if you're gaining muscle at a faster pace than you're gaining fat, you're seeing your body fat percentage go down. And that was like the unicorn. That sounded amazing to like everyone, me included. So my experience there is like I definitely have been in both extreme camps and then kind of come closer to the middle where I realized, I don't want to gain as fast as what I did in the past because I certainly got over fat and it meant I had to cut for quite a long period of time and didn't feel too good about it. But equally, I was spinning on my wheels for quite a long period of time, just trying to kind of, gain or main gain. And not to say that I didn't gain any muscle during that period of time, but considering how hard I was trying to gain muscle and I could have helped myself that little bit more by giving myself a little bit more food, which ultimately is a very easy thing to do kind of practically or like simply put. I guess we can get into some of the challenges there. I've kind of come back to like a middle ground where, there's definitely place for kind of I guess, I don't even know what the term would be, just like a controlled mass.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things to touch on there. And isn't it funny how we can always blame the internet and the memes within the fitness industry? And for those people who think that a meme is just like a photo with a caption on or whatever, it's like a meme is a socially understood concept at any point in time. And the meme I think that's relevant here is bulking and then transitioning to what was trendy and like commonly understood with the lean gains. Like we can always blame the internet for years worth of people spinning their wheels. And I find that really fascinating that how we all got it wrong for quite some time. There would have been a good few years where I think everyone started to push out some less than optimal information. But the key point there is that the massing phase is really seeing a difference in the nutritional approach and the setup of diet variables compared to, say, a fat loss phase or a maintenance phase. And we'll get into the training and some of the differences there later. But over to you, Mackenzie. How do we set up nutrition for a massing phase to achieve that objective of obviously building muscle whilst keeping the ratio of fat to muscle gain favorable from a body composition perspective?
That's a fantastic question, and thank you for asking it. So I want to take a bit of a step back actually when it comes to setting up nutrition for a muscle gain or mass phase, whatever you want to call it. Now, we've discussed the benefits of being in a caloric surplus, how that is something that contributes to an enhanced level of anabolism in conjunction with protein nutrition as well as training. But I think one key thing actually to realize is that all because it's optimal doesn't mean it's worth it. And this is also coming from a place of self-experience, or my own experience, is that um, sometimes we haven't really thought about whether we're willing and wanting to accept body fat gain to maximize muscle mass. And sometimes we approach a phase of training and nutrition thinking, okay, I'm going to commit. I'm going to do this. I'm going to commit to the muscle gain thing. But we end up kind of not really doing the calorie surplus like we should. We kind of end up doing that gain-taining thing. So I think a really important thing to do before you go about asking, how am I going to set up my calorie surplus, is actually asking, do I really want to do this? Like, why do I want to do it? What are the benefits? What's the risk versus reward, or the pros versus cons to me and what I really want? I think if you just don't go through that phase and you just sort of rush in to say, I want to do a muscle gain phase like I once did, you end up kind of wasting a lot of time, just kind of being in a surplus, but then not really truly committing to it. And then, as Steve said, just sort of gain-taining. So once you've gotten that out of the road, well, really, I think it should be a stepwise approach where you start off with a foundation of whole foods, and a baseline of adequate protein. And then once you've adhered to recommendations of dietary guidelines and you've consumed enough protein to meet ideal protein intake recommendations, which is usually somewhere in the order of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo, give or take, depending on where you look. Once you've done that, then there's an option to add those additional calories through calorie enhancers, which don't necessarily provide nutritional value in the form of micronutrition or fiber or protein, but rather just provide calories or fuel for good training, and then to create that caloric surplus to maximize anabolism and thus muscle gain. So start with the foundation, whole foods and protein, layer the calorie enhancers on until you've hit your total calorie targets. And there's a few reasons for that, which we can go into if you guys would like, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good approach. And in terms of meeting the calorie requirements for a surplus, the literature and the consensus in the industry is anywhere from a 200 to 500 calorie surplus, with rate of gain of somewhere between 0.5% of body weight per month to anywhere 1 to 2% per month, depending on your level of advancement and obviously your genetic potential for muscle gain. So, Mackenzie, continue on there. How do we then sort of layer in all the other variables for nutrition?
Okay, so we look at recommendations of dietary guidelines in Australia. We've got 300 grams of fruit as a minimum per day, 400 grams of vegetables as a minimum per day. And then we have 6 servings of whole grains. So, for example, a serving of whole grains is going to be 2 slices of bread, or 30 grams uncooked of a particular grain, such as oats. Obviously, there's going to be variations depending on where you are, but you want to sort of cover off those basics first and foremost. And, just for the sake of an example, that might get you towards 50% of what your actual calorie targets are for you to be in appropriately sized surplus to maximize muscle gain. So how do you get those extra calories? So you've got your whole foods there, you've got your protein, you've got half your calories, you've still got 50% of your calories to make up. Now, there's a few ways you could go. You could say, okay, I'm going to just eat more of the same thing. I'm going to eat more whole foods, more oats, more fruits and vegetables, more lean proteins. But the issue with that is that not only is that diet not overly palatable, or there's not a higher degree of taste appeal to it, it's also quite voluminous. There's a lot of surface area and fiber. And when we're pushing caloric intake beyond our maintenance, sometimes we can experience a little bit of pushback in the form of a reduced appetite over time. So one way we can actually counter this is by, instead of just eating more whole foods, we can add in, or to make up those extra calories, that's when we look for the lower fiber, tastier, typically more processed style foods. And that's going to afford us a feasible way of getting those calories in, both from a just I have an appetite for it because, generally going to gravitate towards tastier foods. But also when we think about gut comfort during training and just generally not feeling like you have to force feed yourself at least as much. So it's, I guess, a bit of a layering approach, and it's a bit of a right tool for the job type of situation. There are situations where indeed Cocoa Pops, sports drinks, those sort of things that most people would typically put an unhealthy label on can be exactly the right tool for the job for someone who wants to eat a little bit more calories. And I think it's a good idea to modulate how much you lean on those things relative to whole foods based on your appetite relative to the calories that you're trying to eat. So for some people with a really high appetite, they might not need to rely on these more highly processed foods as much to consistently hit their calorie target. So there's a bit of an individual factor there. And I guess the critique would be, well, sports drinks, they're bad for you. Oh, Cocoa Pops, like they're bad. It's like, well, you're already hitting your whole food foundation and hitting the recommendations specified by the dietary guidelines. It's at least speculative at best, that there's going to be more benefits to more whole foods, but there's definitely negatives in the form of feasibility of hitting those calorie targets and the comfort in doing so, and how that might affect training performance, which is the stimulus to the thing that you're trying to actually achieve, which is muscle growth. So if that's shit, then don't expect great muscle growth.
Yeah, hit the nail on the head there. I definitely think a lot of people would be better served not having that phobia.
Is Jacob frozen for you as well, Mackenzie?
Oh
no, now I can't hear. Oh no, here we go.
Oh no, okay, here we go.
But as I was saying, I think that's a brilliant point. And as many people know, the pendulum in the fitness industry swings no matter the topic. And we've seen that with the clean eating to the if it fits your macros, and it's sort of come back to the middle a little bit. But I definitely think there's still a lot of people, who are somewhat fearful to, include those processed foods, because of that, the halo effects that certain foods do have. So that's awesome. I think we've obviously got the importance of a calorie surplus.
That Aussie internet.
Damn it. I thought maybe it was me.
What's that?
You just froze for a bit, Jacob.
I don't know why it's freezing. Steve, over to you. Let's talk about some of the finer details around, say, nutrient timing. So let's start with protein. So what are some of the considerations with protein? How much do we want to have at each meal, and when? And if you can then touch on peri-workout nutrition, I think that will be a good way to sort of round out this initial discussion on nutrition.
Sure. Yeah, I think, and by the way, I think Mackenzie did a great job of outlining that, because, I think, and like you said, Jacob, the pendulum has definitely swung either way. And that's like a whole podcast. Is like I could talk about so many experiences with that personally and with clients and everything. But to kind of dig into this topic, I think, like Mackenzie laid out, kind of calories and protein are your kind of biggest players when you're trying to kind of grow muscle. And so when we're considering protein, the most important thing to get right is hitting that end number by the end of the day. So it doesn't matter if you're kind of having your protein shake post-workout and you're getting your kind of Greek yogurt before bed with your casein to slowly digest through the night to try and get any kind of little optimal points that you could possibly get. If you're not hitting your total protein through the day, you're sacrificing a huge player there. So most important for people is to get that total protein through the day. Like Mackenzie laid out the numbers there, like anywhere around 1 gram per pound. But like you said, like you can go a bit above, a bit below. Like it kind of depends on a few variables, and we don't have like a pinpoint answer for you either. Also potentially depends on body fat levels. But anyway, to talk about then how to spread that through the day in terms of nutrient timing, I think what we're looking for is to obviously maximize muscle protein synthesis. So that is essentially muscle growth. And you therefore, when you're eating protein, that is an opportunity to kind of bolster that. And so we want to do that several times through the day, because it will kind of come down once you kind of have an amount that will kind of potentially maximize it. Every time you eat protein, you're going to see a muscle protein synthetic response. I think some people think, like, if you don't eat like the notorious like 20 grams of high quality protein, you're not getting MPS. You are, you're just not maximizing it because you're unlikely getting the leucine threshold and all the other amino acids. So to simplify, get most of your protein from high quality full amino acid sources. That's like any animal source. If you're a plant-based, that's soy protein, or you might have to combine like pea and rice, that sort of thing, or potentially supplement with some EAAs or even leucine. I wouldn't recommend that because I've heard it's disgusting. I haven't actually ever tried doing that. And then you want to spread that through the day through probably to maximize for hypertrophy outcomes. I think probably the research tends to lean towards more like 4 to 5 through the day versus like the 3 up to 6. But I think you're kind of, it isn't going to be practically hugely significant if you're having between 3 to 6, and spread that roughly evenly through the day, front ending your day, kind of having breakfast relatively soon after you wake up and having a protein bolus, and then back ending your day. Doesn't have to be a casein-based protein. There's no harm in doing that. There might be some upside, probably minimal as well, but back ending your day and then having maybe a lunch with protein.
Back ending, is that different to a bell end? Just to be sure.
How'd you have to make it sexual?
Only with you, Steve.
So, basically a breakfast, like a pre-bed, a post-workout, and like a lunch or whatever. You're hitting your numbers there. But that can be flexible. And again, like you can grow muscle with like intermittent fasting. As an advanced athlete, probably going to be very challenging. And for anyone else, probably it's going to be more challenging and slower. So anyway, that's basically where I come from a protein perspective. Is your kind of total protein is most important. Then try and spread that anywhere from 3 to 6 with maybe 4 to 5 servings evenly spread through the day to be kind of quote unquote slightly more optimal. And then when we're considering kind of the peri-workout nutrition, I mostly just look at this as kind of look at your carbohydrate intake. Or yeah, it depends if some people may only have a protein and calorie goal, which I think is highly appropriate for the majority of people. If you are like a very serious bodybuilder or someone who's highly competitive, you might want to think about potentially kind of having a higher carbohydrate intake and maybe slightly lower fat, but still getting your bases covered. I think there's theoretical rationale for that. I don't know if I could hold my hat on it, but I certainly wouldn't go keto. If that's something someone was considering, I don't think that's best for performance outcomes. And so I would just make sure to place a large chunk of your carbohydrates pre and post workout, potentially even peri, like you said. You can have an energy drink kind of within your session, or like a carbohydrate based drink if you've got long, high volume sessions or you're struggling to take calories in. That can also be a great way to do it. You can top off glycogen stores, replenish glycogen stores, potentially a little bit quicker if you do it that way. Maintain blood glucose a little bit better, and that could potentially help performance within the gym, focus within the gym. And I think that's a sound approach. And then you just don't want to have tons of fat and fiber like pre-workout. Like Mackenzie said, if you eat all like quote unquote kind of clean, wholesome foods, you're going to struggle like within your sessions, feeling bloated, and digestion is going to be slow. So don't have tons of fiber and fat close to the workout, and potentially avoid having high amounts of that post-workout too, to kind of get out of the way of kind of potentially restoring glycogen a little bit faster if that's something that seems to be important for you. And that's the basis of the way I approach it is fairly simple. Like spread that protein through the day, 4 to 6 feedings, and then just don't have tons of fat and fiber around your workout and prioritize carbs at that time. I think beyond that can get into like minutia, and it can just cause people a little bit more stress and toll and lack of like consistency and adherence.
Yeah, 100%. I think in terms of the benefits, the details outside of what you've just outlined there, I think have far less reward for way greater effort. But they're fantastic recommendations, and simple rule of thumb that I advise my clients and that I use in practice, just 25% of your total daily carbohydrate intake. I thought I froze there. On either side of the workouts, and then something around 1.5 grams of carbohydrates per kilo of body weight within 3 hours after your workout, if you don't want to use the percentage of your total daily intake. But fantastic recommendations there, Steve. And I guess once we've set up the nutrition side of things, the next fundamental step is to measure and assess the outcome, right? And obviously, we're going to get into training soon because that's a huge piece of the puzzle here. But let's discuss the metrics that we use to measure. Mackenzie, we've touched on this in previous podcasts in terms of how we assess body composition practically and pragmatically. So without going into, I guess, the pros and cons of different techniques, let's attack, what are the measurement techniques that somebody should be using during a massing phase? to assess whether or not they're getting the desired outcome?
So, assuming the desired outcome is to gain muscle size and muscle strength. So, the muscle strength one I feel is quite straightforward, and that is, am I progressing in my performance in the gym? And that can be approached in a few ways, whether you try and look at a certain performance reps, load times sets or something, or you just pick a lift and, do that at the start of a mesocycle for a given amount of reps and see how many more reps you can do for that weight, or if you could do more weight for the same amount of reps. That can be a gauge of obviously performance. But I actually also think personally that it is one of the best proxies to muscle gain. Now, it's not necessary that gains in performance are always a product of increased muscle size. There are, or related in that way, rather, like whichever way it comes first, chicken, egg, whatever you want to call it. But, when we think about the other ways we can assess muscle size, there's a lot of issues with them. For example, muscle gain is a really slow process. The incremental change over a week, a month, might not even be detectable through the measurement error factor of a DEXA scan, which is considered the gold standard. And then we have other things like skin folds. I think they're pretty cool, as long as you're not trying to calculate body fat percentage with some kind of formula and just looking at the sum of sites taken. And an average weekly scale weight, that's pretty awesome, but obviously scales have their issue. And then there's photos, which is something that we discussed, but there's also issues there, as there's a lot of subjective thoughts and feelings that might cloud one's vision of what's actually happened. And, I think personally, not as a bodybuilder or not as a bodybuilding coach, and someone who doesn't work in that space, I tend to try and, I would never or very rarely actively recommend using scale weight or photos or anything that looks at body appearance, unless, for example, it's a athlete in a certain weight class sport, in which case it's a real factor. But for someone trying to gain muscle or doing a muscle gain phase, usually I wouldn't steer away necessarily, but I wouldn't be the one to say, hey, you should measure, or we should, look at measuring this. Rather, I'd try and steer the conversation more towards like a performance outcome. So focusing on what the body does as opposed to how the body looks. And that's for various reasons, which I won't get into right now.
That's because you're a woke social justice warrior looking after people's mental health. And we hate you for that. No, but I think
You're right.
I would say that I disagree with some aspects of that, but I totally understand that you work with a very different demographic to what Steve and I work with. So there's absolute utility to that approach. And I think not only that, I think the way that you frame that is actually a very good thing for a lot of people to focus on the performance side of things over the outcome, right? Because we're measuring outcomes with scale weight, circumference measures, progress photos. Like that's not a process or performance-based measure, right? That's an outcome measure. We know the difference between outcome goals versus performance and process-related goals, right? So I think there's a lot of utility in that perspective and looking at measurements through that lens and framing it in that way for athletes. The only addition I would have there is that training performance, I think for muscle growth, obviously has to improve because the larger muscle relative to its size can produce more force, meaning that it can lift the same weight for more reps, as you said, or more reps with the same load, provided that you keep set volume and your proximity to failure relatively constant, because changing either of those variables, in my opinion, is either just doing more work in the case of adding sets, or if you're just training closer to failure, you're just making training harder. So that's not really observing the progressive overload or increases in fitness capacity, which are muscle growth in our case here. But I think that needs to be in conjunction with measurement on the scale, because sometimes these phenomena can be very tricky to measure with only one measurement technique, and you need to bring multiple different techniques to measure the outcome, because there are some pitfalls to just using training performance. For example, if you're changing exercises, neurological adaptations, fluctuations in fitness fatigue dynamics and readiness in a given session can all affect training performance. So that might on its own not reliably tell you that you're gaining muscle, because your performance might go down for some period of time if you've going through a stressful period. You might be training with more volume, changing exercises, whatever the case may be. And if scale weight's going up or your circumference measures are going up, that can help give you a better understanding of what's going on at the level of the muscle, because performance is influenced by so many factors. That's my take on it. I'll hand it over to Steve or Mackenzie if you've got anything to add to that. But I definitely agree that the lens that you look at measuring progress through is really important. And I think there should be a huge focus on the process and performance-based goals instead of outcome goals, as Mackenzie alluded to. Steve?
Yeah, I would definitely reiterate that in terms of, I like that lens as well that Mackenzie looked it through in terms of like focusing on the process and kind of the things that are going to lead to the outcome goal versus leading on kind of, are we there yet in terms of muscle growth? And I've had clients who have taken kind of circumference measurements every week, and I'm like, don't do that, because every time, like, I never recommend it. And every time they do that, they get quite stressed out about it because they're like, oh, my waist measurement's gone up by this much or whatever. Like, and I'm like, in a week, you're not gaining that amount of body fat where you're going to see an inch added to your waist unless we're doing something incredibly wrong with our nutrition here, or like you're likely bloated or the holding water, or more than likely human measurement error. And so I completely agree with you there, Jacob, in terms of trying to like triangulate. So use many of these tools to see if they're all moving in the same direction to give you an idea of, okay, so weight's going up, progress in the gym's going up, like circumference measurements, photos, they're all pointing in the same direction. More than likely we're ticking that box of muscle growth, because I remember talking to Ben House on my podcast about this. And I mean, this is circling all the way back to the start where like a lot of it's influenced through social media, because I think a lot of it's just driven down from like enhanced bodybuilders initially, and now like my scientists have got into field and things, but with like 2 studies that have ever looked on like calorie surpluses, and neither of them are particularly good or applicable. So it's hard to have like
smart natties who have to figure shit out because
yeah,
it's all foreign, right?
exactly. So it's just, and Ben said in the podcast, it's like especially as like a pretty well trained bodybuilder, for us guys, like we often won't even know if we've gained muscle until we take it to the stage again and look at photos or compare stage weights, because it's so challenging to truly know it. And even like you said, strength can be like fluctuate quite like readily, even down to maybe you improve your technique on this lift, whatever it might be. So there's a lot of almost, I don't like to say trusting the process, because it makes it sound like you have to trust the things that we know grow muscle. But so long as people are eating and they're slowly gaining weight at an appropriate pace, and they're seeing their performance in the gym over time go up, or rather they are training hard in the gym with what would be appropriate amounts of work and not excessive amounts. Like I'm almost like, you just have to keep watering that natty plant and it will slowly be growing over time. You just have to keep the sunlight on there, the water on there, and you won't see it growing, but until you check on at a much longer and later date.
And I think that's a really good point there, is like, and I know that Mackenzie will agree with this because we've had this conversation. It's like the issue with these tools such as scale weight, progress photos, is just like scale, like when people measure their scale weight, it's like their perspective of what that actually means is usually the problem, but then the problem is also enhanced by the frequency of the measurement, right? And that's where I think, with progress photos and circumference measurements in a massing phase, like these things should be done very infrequently. Like they're not tools that you need to use very often, because they won't pick up on much, over the course of, 1, 2, 3 weeks. They're things you should use, 3, 6 months, at a time. Scale weight, possibly a little bit more regularly, but yeah, I think there's a huge element of like the frequency at which you use these tools that plays into, I guess, how potentially damaging they can be to, somebody's enjoyment of the process. Because as we know, if somebody's, not seeing that progress and they're getting disheartened because they're not seeing any changes, it can really detriment their effort towards the process, right? And I think, on that, Steve, I think, yeah, trust the process is a throwaway comment for a lot of people. But if you've got a really good process, you have every reason to trust it, right? And I think that's the difference, right? It's like this similar quote, like jack of all trades, master of none. But if you're only a master of one trade, right, you're a connector of none. So there's like always different ways to add on to, statements like that, I think. And trusting the process is important, but we need to make sure we've got good processes, reliable ones in place, because then we can trust it. And that comes with experience and obviously, some expertise and knowledge in the process. Mac, I've seen you there. You're chewing at the bit to chime in here. Bouncing around.
No, I'm not chewing a bit. I just had
Chewing
too
it.
much coffee, mate.
Steve, that's an Aussie term for like ready and eager.
I've heard of it actually.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Hold me back. Hold me back. Hold it. I just wanted to make an additional point in regards to how we assess progress, and I want to be a woke person here. So you mentioned there that the issue with scale weight is often our thoughts or how we perceive that outcome, and I think this opens the door to actually another avenue of progress assessment, which can actually be how we feel and our behaviors. So we can actually use adherence to certain behaviors as a means of progress. So for example, pre-bed protein snack. I've recently got a client who is looking at gaining muscle. The amount of protein feedings consistently being consumed is sort of on that lower end of the ideal range. So the target habit discussed was an additional protein snack. The action plan specified pre-bed. Now, adherence to that habit can actually be a source of progress in conjunction or on top of other measures of muscle growth and performance. And the good thing about this is it's not fixated on appearance, and rather at a behavior that can make someone feel good about what they're doing. And also, because it's a frequent thing, it creates frequent opportunities to celebrate a win. And when we feel positive about our abilities or our self-efficacy improves, we're generally going to be more motivated. The self-efficacy and motivation, sort of, there's a link there. And we're probably going to stay in the game for a little bit longer. We stay in the game for longer. Guess what? As a product of that, in the background, we've gained more muscle because, as I'm sure all of you guys would agree, muscle growth requires a long period of time ticking the boxes. Unlike a fat loss phase, you can't do a mini bulk or a mini mass. You can do a mini cut, but a mini bulk doesn't really work. No one's going to be doing a 4-week.
I want to see you try. I want to see some anecdotal evidence of your 4-week mini bulk, Mac.
Maybe next time I'm somewhere where there's a gym, I'll have to do a mini bulk because, I've got to get my training in somehow.
I really like that. I think we should have different measures in place. Obviously, training measurements are important in terms of performance. I think some form of scale weights and visual circumference measurements also important as well. But on top of that, right, we need to have those, behavior targets that we're focusing on, because essentially it's like, yes, training's one behavior that we need to do, and that's a really big one. But all the other behaviors, whether it's protein feedings, whether it's meeting your calorie surplus, whether it's your peri-workout nutrition. I think Steve, a huge benefit to the pre-workout and post-workout meal, as you were discussing, performance-wise. I think from a behavioral perspective, people aren't focusing on that enough, because it can really anchor your nutrition around the workout. And we know that people often feel better after they train. So, if they have a, quote unquote on plan or optimal meal, it's like it can set them up for subsequent meals. And with a lot of, building muscle and, achieving any goal, it's about momentum. And I think, we can create a lot of momentum in that, peri-workout window. So I think, you've got to have those behavior targets as well. And as Max said, ticking those off regularly over time is ultimately what's going to lead to muscle. And that takes care of those outcome measurements. And I think incorporating all of those is super beneficial. But Steve, let's talk about now, in terms of rate of gain and adjusting, the plan or nutrition, what are your, steps when somebody reaches a plateau or stall, they're not gaining weight on the scale, or they're not seeing that performance in the gym? How do you attack a stall, and how do you define a stall in a massing phase?
Cool. So if I attack the kind of body weight nutritional stall, or rather I see that as something that you would manage through nutrition generally, I kind of think about it this way in terms of, if you are coming out of a mini cut or a longer dieting period, then there's probably going to be like more regular adaptations that are going to need to take place with nutrition, because your metabolism will adapt upwards to that new nutrition that's coming in, because it's probably adapted slightly downwards during that diet phase. And so you'll probably need to increase food more regularly. You might not need to, and always base it off like scale weight changes. The number of, I don't know, this is a separate topic, but the number of like questions I get, it's like, I'm hungry in my mass phase, should I increase food? I'm like, don't base it off appetite. Like go back to Mackenzie, and where he said eat more of that kind of wholesome food that's going to fill you up. Don't kind of try and fill the void through just gaining at a faster pace. That's not the way to do it. You want to base it off scale weight changes. But it's then having that kind of foresight of, okay, so if I'm in a surplus, the body doesn't readily adapt to it that quickly once I've been in it for a while. So it should see me for a long period of time. So where on a diet phase, you might look every 1 to 2 weeks for someone, you're not looking every 1 to 2 weeks to make an adjustment to your nutrition on a mass gaining phase. You're looking every, at most 2 weeks to every like 4 weeks plus. And so, because the rate of change is also much smaller, we're not looking for like where you might change a % of body weight on a weekly basis during a diet phase. It's like 0.5% at most during a mass gaining phase. So you need to look at a longer time window. So I'm looking at kind of bi-weekly averages, making sure that they're moving within that kind of window. And I quite like having a wider range for rate of gain, where it's like, as long as it's acceptable kind of within this range, we're not trying to target exactly 0.5 or exactly 0.25. Like, try and land somewhere within this range, or rather every 2 weeks. Like, that's 0.5 to 1% for a lot of people. So anywhere within there is totally acceptable. We just want to make sure we're kind of in that buffer zone. And then if we can say, okay, it's been 2 weeks, or we haven't seen you moving in this direction, and there's no like outside circumstances that could be impacting that, because off seasons are long, or just like gaining phases are long, like you said, and people's lifestyles and things are variable. And so you have to make sure that it isn't one of those outside variables that have impacted it, like they're eating out all the time, and I don't know, that could be making it look different to how it should be on paper. In a diet phase, often your food is very, very similar, like day to day, whereas in a mass gaining phase, it isn't always. So I like the number of people I work with where I can't use a 2 week average. I have to look longer than that and make sure that I'm making the right call. But when I have seen that it seems to be slowing, or it looks like it's maybe come to around a maintenance, I'm maybe just adjusting 100 calories and then seeing where it goes from there. And then if, again, it's not moving after a week or two, I might then push another 100, because it doesn't take much to move the needle for the surplus that we're trying to achieve, because it's a relatively small surplus. So yeah, that's how I generally look at more like trying to make sure that someone's moving within that rate of gain is 2 to 4 weeks averages. How's it trending over time? Make sure that it is actually due to not nutritional variability, and then just small calorie bumps to keep them within that range over time.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot. Mackenzie, anything you want to add to that?
Probably not, actually. I think the first, one point actually is, I think when there is a plateau on the scales in either direction, whether you're going for weight loss or weight gain, I think it's probably often, but not always maybe, a good idea to not jump the gun and understand that there are many different factors that influence body mass at a certain time point. Many of them can fluctuate quite significant amounts on a day-to-day basis, and they are independent to changes in muscle mass and body fat mass. So if you have, say, a 7-day period of a plateau, and I don't think it's prudent to say, oh, I'm not in a surplus anymore, I need to increase my calories. Because if you do that, you might be chopping the ceiling down of how long you could continue to gain weight and muscle before you need to implement a mini cut, because you get a little bit too fluffy, and that can be suboptimal for actual muscle gain. But also there's the obvious issues with appearance. And in the case of athletes in gravitational sports, CrossFitters, for example, you're gaining body fat that's going to weigh you down and impact or impair your performance. So yeah, just kind of taking a moment to not jump the gun. Should we give it a little bit more time? Should we wait another week to see what body weight trends do? And often they end up sort of playing ball. It just might not be linear. And, people say progress is never linear. I think that certainly applies to a muscle gain phase as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that's an important point because there are so many confounding variables that influence scale weight, as a lot of people will know. Sleep, meal timing, macronutrient intake, fiber intake, activity, stress, hormones. Like there are a multitude of things that can wreak havoc with your scale weight. So in a massing phase, it's really important to give it a little bit longer before you make an adjustment because, there can be some fluctuations, and obviously muscle growth takes a lot of time to um occur at a physiological level. Like I think that's what people don't appreciate is like you're literally packing on protein throughout the day and unpacking it, and you're packing on sweet fuck all in terms of absolute weight. Like we're talking, I think, for most people they'd be lucky to get 50 to 100 grams a week. Like that's a great result. So you're not going to see a lot of scale weight increase from muscle mass. Most of it's going to be due to the amount of food you're eating, the calorie surplus, the fat, glycogen, holding some extra water. Yep, you get that muscle as well. Increase in gut residue, all of these things. So you do need to understand there are so many things that can influence your weight independent of the actual muscle that you're building. So you have to be really patient with that and not jump the gun when you're making those assessments. I think that's really important to understand. So great points, guys. And let's turn to, I think we're gonna have to do a part two potentially on training, because this has been quite a juicy discussion. Let's talk about some of the challenges nutritionally to keep it on trend with the rest of the discussion when people are massing. So Steve, I know that you're somebody who struggles when the food intake gets excessively high. And you've come from a background where gaining weight has been quite difficult for you. So I think, you're probably the man to discuss this. So have at it, challenges during a massing phase.
Cool. And I just want to reiterate with Mackenzie there, like his point about like not jumping the gun makes a ton of sense there. So I would just reiterate that as well. Like I have clients who are like, oh, I haven't gained weight in a week, 2 weeks, whatever it might be. And I'm always in favor of, right, so like nutrition is just permissive of the training we're doing. As long as you're training really well and your training is going very, very well, like let's kind of just see it out. And sometimes people even get these like, I guess they're like, you can almost look at them as a kind of what's it called? A spurt in weight gain. Like it's a growth spurt, but in weight gain where they just suddenly come up and then they hit a new high and they just like stall out at that for a little bit. So I think the key there is just like you said, patience. And then in regards to, nutrition during off season, actually kind of fundamental, what I see most common with people is they don't do what Mackenzie suggested in terms of having a baseline of like meeting the nutritional priorities that we have to hit. They hit their protein, but they're not getting that fruit, they're not getting that veg in, they're not getting those whole grains in, their fiber's pitiful, and they're just going, oh, mass gaining means I move to Cocoa Pops only, or whatever it is, and they just start eating all this food, and then they are hungry, and then they're wondering why they're not adhering to their diet. They're eating out often and not really considering it because they're like, oh, I'm in a surplus. And then their gaining phase is now half the time it should be because they've gained at double the rate that they should. So I often see people get really lax during their gaining phases because they're so long. But you have to keep a lot of those kind of principal habits that you have during a cut phase, and obviously don't kind of keep yourself on a leash like you might on a cut. You want to be a bit more free and flexible, but don't go all the way over there. So that's one side I see. And then in regards to, my issue, it seems to be, I used to talk about settling points and like a settling range, but now it seems to be actually it's a kind of dual intervention model where we have like an upper and lower level of body weight or body fat where we feel our best. And in a mass gaining phase, you want to basically be within this window where you feel your best, where it's kind of, I guess, quote unquote, homeostasis for your body, where it's comfortable because you can train your best where you feel your best. And some people like myself are relatively lean when they're within that window and they knock upon that kind of higher intervention point a little bit sooner, and it's a more of a wall than like like an easy thing that they can just move through. A lot of people just move through that very, very easily and they gain like huge amounts of body weight very comfortably. So for some people like me who, I don't know, quote unquote, a hard gainer, or people just don't have those appetites, where it kind of makes sense to keep pushing up because if they want to push the needle of body muscle mass, then they do want to do that. Then it is a case of, like Mackenzie said, like don't just eat all whole grains and all fruits, veggies, and have tons of fiber. You reduce those and introduce easier ways to get food in. So it might even be looking at, okay, I need this many fruits, but can I move towards dried fruit? Can I move towards fruit juices, smoothies? I need to get these many veggies in, but can I move towards soups and other ways, purees to get those in? And then maybe I shouldn't eat my oats. I should move to cream of rice as a bodybuilder, or even Cocoa Pops, like the same thing really. Move towards these other foods that are going to just make it easier to get food in, more liquid foods, more palatable foods, salt food, use sauces. That sort of thing can go a long way to helping people. And even looking down the line of like, is there any FODMAPs? Like, is there anything within your diet that is just causing you distress? And you could look at like, have I got any of these high FODMAP foods in my diet? And that's causing me a problem, because sometimes that can be it. So it's just kind of being a little bit clever with palatability, food volume, and then just seeing if there are any like actual digestive issues that you're creating from some of your food selection. And maybe you are just hitting above this like intervention point, and that's where mini cuts can come in, because they're super handy for just reducing body fat. But for that person, you're not really doing that. It's to increase appetite. And I can talk from experience, just like 2 weeks of harsh calorie restriction, my appetite is in a much better place. I do it for another 2 weeks, and I bought myself another like 4 months of good appetite with massing. So those are some of the strategies I'd be looking at when someone's kind of struggling to get that food in on a mass gaining phase.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And we essentially do all the things, completely in the opposite way to when we're cutting, right? It's like, it's just the reverse, walking that hedonic scale, going back down essentially, making things more energy dense, more palatable, lower fiber, all that kind of jazz. And I think, it's a matter of being clever with your dietary choices when the hunger and appetite become an issue, and potentially increasing meal frequency as well. I found to be a good strategy, so that you're consuming smaller meals. But very good points there, Steve. And guys, we have run out of time. Mackenzie's got to bounce. So that is all for this installment of the Education Portal Roundtable on massing. I think we're going to have to get the boys back on to discuss training. So leave that with me. Hopefully we can organize a time. But I hope you all enjoyed everything that we covered, and you learned a lot. And thank you, guys. We'll speak to you all next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening,
guys.